So I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn, which will be moderated by Ken Brooks, who's chair of our Industry Supply Chain Committee. Ken has several roles in the industry, currently overseeing operations at Amplify Education, and you probably also know him from his career with Publishing Technology Partners and his consulting practice. Um, our speaker today is Kevin Spall, who is responsible for global procurement for Scholastic. He's had that role for several years. But Kevin also has an unusual background that you probably read about in registering for this event, in that he's worked for publishers and printers alike. It's a good combination for the role that he has and also for the perspective that he's going to be sharing today. Kevin also serves as a member of the BISG board representing the publisher segment, in this case, Scholastic. Kevin, thank you for making the time today. I know you prepared probably about 15 minutes of perspective from your
Sorry, I thought I did.
on your work.
Why isn't it working?
Before we begin, I just want to ask people, if you haven't muted yourself, you should, because we can hear you. And I'll put a note in the chat as well. Kevin, thank you again and welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. Brian asked if I'd be interested in doing this, and I said that I would. And I always wake up day of and wonder why I volunteered for this stuff. But given what's happening in our country today, I welcome the distraction from all the noise that's out and about. So yeah, I think I have 3, 4, 5 slides here. Hoping that this is a conversation. Ken, if you want to break in at any point, if there's a question, rather than me just flying through the slides, or I can fly through the slides and then have more of an open conversation. There's a lot of people on the call today that I have done business with, we continue to do business with, and I want to thank them all for coming. Many of whom, all of whom, are a part of this presentation that I'm going to be sharing with you. So please feel free to throw some questions into the chat. The second slide there is fine, Brian. So I gave a talk at the BISG board national meeting a couple years ago on chaos. And I think we could all agree, post-pandemic, certainly starting a pandemic, and even to this day, we would all recognize there's a lot of chaos happening within our world. When I came into Scholastic in 2019, it was pretty stable. And of course, a year later, all hell broke loose. And sometimes when you join an organization and there's upheaval like that, it's a good opportunity to lean in and learn more about the organization, which certainly my team and I did during that process. The way we're looking at our platform now, different from pre-pandemic, I would say, generally speaking, and I think this was the case for many big publishers. We looked at the globe regionally, and we would place a percentage of work in Asia, perhaps certainly in the U.S. Maybe we had 1 or 2 other areas where we identified. We placed a format, we kind of left it there and let it bake, and it worked very, very well for a long time. The pandemic hit and all things changed. I think, as I recall, during that time, we had about 50 million units that were displaced. And when I say displaced, it was just our vendors calling up and saying, listen, we don't have labor. We can't do this for you. And so we had titles pushing out 3 and 6 months. It was a real problem for us. And so with that as the backdrop, we've changed our thinking, and we're really looking at the globe as our platform now. We're moving work constantly. I would say we're almost more transactional, certainly now, than what I believe Scholastic had been in the past. And one of the things that I talk about here is how quickly can you pivot. When the pandemic hit, we saw the news reports coming in from the world that things were happening. We really couldn't react very quickly, and I think back now, why that was, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move on. But how quick can you pivot? Whether that's, we keep hearing about the next pandemic, container costs. We just had another issue a couple of months ago where container costs were spiking. Tariffs, depending on what happens today, we may see a significant increase in tariffs that will affect everyone's volume across the globe. We've got port strikes. I was just on a supply chain call this morning where we're talking about port strikes that are looming on the West Coast. We averted one on the East Coast a month or so ago, but we have another opportunity for that to happen in January. And then generally speaking from the industry, there's just a lack of capacity. When we would do big runaway bestsellers like Harry Potter and others, there were a couple of printers that would be engaged in that. Meryl Wolf, who worked with me, would place large 3, 4, 5 million print runs with one printer, and that's just not a possibility anymore. So there's just generally a lack of capacity. We've got to split work up, and we've got to look at the globe as our platform. And then tools is a big part of it. What I mean by tools is how are you manufacturing, specifically digital is offset. Are teams prepared to pivot to digital if they have to, if it's generally an offset world? Obviously, material alternatives, we're in a much better place today than we were a couple of years ago. But do we have standard paper specifications? Do we have alternatives? And then that one piece, I'm not sure if Irene Chan is on the call here, but Irene runs our pre-press, managing our color management across the globe. And when we've got one printer in Asia using different reds than our printers in the US, how do we reconcile that? These are all things that when you flatten the globe and use that as your platform, you've really got to get into and understand. If you go to the next slide, Brian. The first area that I really think about when we talk about using the globe as our platform is the culture. When the pandemic hit and we needed to move work, actually even before the pandemic hit, we had some vendor issues. We wanted to move work and we just couldn't. It just took a long time. It took weeks to get agreement that we were going to move the work. Then we had to figure out how to systemically make that happen. It was difficult. I would say we were not very nimble back then, generally speaking. So first question, is your culture creative and nimble and up for that kind of challenge to move quickly? And do you practice that? And I referenced back, I did a lunch and learn here a few years ago about my company I worked for was under cyber attack. We were being held ransom for 4 Bitcoins. And this was back in 2018. Didn't even know what Bitcoin was. And it locked our whole system down. And to the point where we couldn't send or receive emails. We couldn't print. And so we didn't even have a printer cable to go from a laptop to a printer. So when I say, do you practice being nimble, how often are you getting together with your team to say, what if this happens? If this happens, what do we do? And so we practice a lot of that. We're meeting 2, 3, 4 times a week formally as a supply chain organization to just talk about what we're doing and where we're doing it, what's happening, what hotspots are happening. And we're very connected as a result of that. And on the same page, we discuss our global plan at least once a week, and then multiple other plans around what's happening within the supply chain on any given day. You can go to the next slide, Brian. So culture, big, I think probably the most important area of concern to address when you're looking at global manufacturing. The second one I would say is your partners, and I've got a lot of our partners on the call right now, whom I could call out. But for us, it was really who is the right partner? What's that profile look like? And I think sometimes the shiny penny may not be the best solution. Do you work well with big companies? small companies, private or public, maybe in between. I think we've settled in with a good group of partners that we work well with, that share our culture, easy to get to and react quickly to us. And that took some time to find those people. But we're quite happy now that we've done that. And then global challenges. When the pandemic hit, we turned to a lot of new players, a lot of new vendors. We found one company in Mexico, IDEO, and we really like them. They have a lot of great capabilities, but we had to kind of help them understand the U.S. market, and that took time. It probably took 6 to 9 months to get us to a place where we were really communicating effectively. We invested in that partnership and still see IDEO as a very strong partner for us. If you would go to the next slide, Brian. The last one here I would say is technology. Are our systems ready to act globally in this way? And what does that mean? We're estimating more now, so we've had to get better at how to estimate for multiple platforms. For example, when we have a title that could go offset or it could go digital, figuring out how to do that quickly and dynamically so we can make immediate decisions. Those are new practices for us. Lead times are changing all the time now. If we turn to India, we've got a very strong partner there, Monopol. And we've had lead times pop up and down, as with our friends in Asia, with Leo and RD. So do you have a system that quickly can adjust lead times and factor that in quickly so you can turn on a little more of a dime? And then lastly, how do you take that estimate, whether you go digital, offset, domestic, offshore, and how do you quickly share that P&L so you can have comparisons and make good decisions around your margins? And I think that's it, Brian. I don't know if that was 15 minutes, but more than 10.
It was a good enough start that I think we'll have a good conversation for the next however long it is.
Right.
So thank you for talking through this stuff. A number of your points caused me to think about some of the points of flexibility. I've been hearing about the events of 2022 as a flock of black swans. And it makes me think about resilience and how you enable that. Do you measure resilience? Like, is there a way to measure it, or are you just pretty much having to do it?
Well, I don't know that we certainly don't have a KPI for resilience. I think we feel it. We measure a lot, particularly as it relates to how well are we executing. So when you have, as an example, the 50 million units that we had to move around during the pandemic, we're measuring in terms of our on-time performance, our vendor performance, our sell-through.
Yeah.
So those are things that we look at every month, and in fact, we invite our top maybe 10 or 15, probably closer to 15 to 20 vendors quarterly, and we go through all those KPIs with them and address them if there are any concerning ones, or celebrate where we're seeing success. That's probably the most consistent measurement that we have in place.
Do you have long-term relationships or contract-based relationships with scales and things with those top vendors?
Sure. We have a combination of, in the case of, I'll call out Steve Merson in Command. That's a very long-standing relationship, decades. And the Command companies have supported us in many ways. We've got agreements, we've got scales with Steve and many other companies. And then I would turn to, I see my friend Mauro from Graphica on the line. Mauro's a relatively new partner for us. Actually started with the pandemic in Italy, and that's Mauro, 4 or 5 year relationship, but we've got Scales, and with their recent relatively recent acquisition of Lakebook in Chicago, we've been working very hard with the Graphica team to figure out how to take advantage of that multi-region partnership that we have. It's been very, very effective for us.
Are you looking for suppliers, or do you use suppliers that can quickly shift among regions or plants, or different kinds of technologies, or do you pretty much want to do that yourself?
I would say that we're always looking for partners who are nimble and creative. Back to my slide. I think it's less about changing regions and more about being flexible within how they're manufacturing for us. If they can't meet our dates, for example, with an offset job, are they able to pivot to digital perhaps and feed us a little bit? And then to get underneath that layer a little bit, can they pivot to digital using that example and have that product look identical to the offset product? So I think the partners we do really well with are those who are quick to be creative around problem solving. And with all this movement on the globe, we've got to have partners that are able to quickly change with us and offer us new ways to produce. Regionally, I would say it's certainly valuable. I mean, what we've done now with the U.S. is becoming more important for us. I don't mean that it was never not important, but I would say let's just make the numbers easy. We had maybe 50% in the U.S. from a production standpoint, and 50% somewhere else. We're trying more to lean into the U.S. with an offshore component. So we'll produce a portion elsewhere and produce a portion on U.S. soil and figure out how we can make that pricing work from a P&L standpoint. So in the case of Graphica, where they have the facility in Italy and the facility in the U.S., it's easier certainly to do that than to have two different companies as a part of that equation.
That's a really interesting strategy. That way you get the benefit of the shorter lead times in the U.S., but the lower cost internationally, right?
That's right. And looking at it from a blended perspective, I think has been really interesting for us. And we're always going to have authors that are going to be a little bit late, so we have to have U.S. partners of strength with capacity.
You mentioned pre-press earlier. When you're moving jobs among different printers, do you set up those files ahead of time, or do you apply profiles and set them up kind of like real time as you're moving them?
I would love to have someone on my team pop in. Tho or Irene, are you on the call? Would you mind commenting on that?
So we do both, Ken, where we can project out in the sense of we're going to set it up for the initial run at multiple vendors where we can plan for that. We do set that up for both. And then on the ad hoc side, we do have to then react quickly to that when we're pivoting from a file going from an offset to digital or offset to offset. So we do both. Where we can plan, we do. Where it's ad hoc, we have a team that will handle the ad hoc process.
Kathy Felgar asked a related question. So how do you handle like differences in spine or those kinds of things when you've got to move jobs among
as we've started to set up our secondary set of vendors, we do try to keep the PPI on the paper the equivalent to our overseas, to domestic or digital and offset, to avoid having to make those adjustments to the spine art. But obviously, when we do, obviously we have to make those adjustments appropriately. so that there is no compromise to the artwork on the spine. But we try to keep it as close to the primary as possible.
Okay. It sounds like with the capabilities that you've built internally, you don't have to have the same company, domestic and international. You can have different companies, and you spend a lot of time in color management and file management. So you can use different companies that may have a domestic presence or not.
We try to the best we can.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't, it sounds like Irene's not on the call, but Irene, who manages a lot of our profiling and color management, does a lot of work up front regarding ink usage and the paper, and to try and get us to a point where we don't have to have different profiles. But she does work regularly with the business unit design team to ensure we're creating PDFs with the right profiles, and it's consistent. We're getting good color, and it's an ongoing maintenance issue, if you will.
And then you keep the central files and then apply the profiles depending on where it's going. It sounds like.
That's right. Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. All right. I'm guessing you developed the habit of like the tabletop exercises and business continuity discussions from some of the more painful experiences in your past. Was that formative, the whole Bitcoin and ransomware, making sure that you're able to sustain a ransomware attack?
Well, I certainly that whole episode is burned into my memory and comes back at random times to force itself upon me. But it does create a desire to pressure test process, and that's one of the reasons why we meet weekly, to just talk about what's happening, what hotspots do we have, are we covered, do we have that printer cable if we do get attacked, certainly as in jest in case, but it's a good visual that I use to force the conversation for our team, and often I think we've got a standing weekly Thursday meeting that is just, I think it's called global volume placement, something of that order, and we have our leaders from the supply chain team come together and just talk about what's happening, and what vendors are we having difficulty with, what should we be looking at, just to stay on top of the what if scenario.
I remember distinctly the BMI interview that you did on ransomware, and I've used that over and over again as an illustrative point. So thank you for doing that.
It was a scary time, and I know there are folks on this call that have had similar experiences, and it's a very lonely place to be. There's not a lot of people that have gone through a cyber attack, and even when you do, the unfortunate, I think I talked about this in the BMI call, the unfortunate reality is people don't want to talk about it. They don't want you to know. They don't want it to get out. And in fact, we probably should be talking more about that and other business continuity issues that we can all share and learn from. Because that example is incredibly destructive.
So Shona is asking a question about when you're swapping among vendors, do you do some kind of soft proofing of the jobs? I had thought that best practice these days was not to do the proofing, but do you do soft proofing? I mean, what do you think about best practice?
We definitely do soft proofing. I would call on Tho to get into the nuances of when and how, if I can lean on you again, Tho. But we're constantly soft proofing, and we still do hard proofs, just to be sure, particularly for those heavy 4-color jobs that we do a lot of, to make sure that the reds are the same kind of reds that we expect, whether it's printed in Asia or with our friends at Quad in Sussex. So did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it like you mentioned, it just depends on the situation, depends on the title, depends on the, first printing, second printing, or 20th printing. But yeah, we practice both soft proof and physical proofs.
Are there printers that you don't need to proof at all?
I'll jump in here, Kevin.
Thanks, Mary.
No, our businesses they're not ready to go totally proofless yet. We hope to get them there sometime soon.
Excellent. It's good to hear from you. I think last time I saw you, it was at we were sitting next to each other at the Scholastic event.
That's right, we were actually.
Yeah.
And I apologize for the background noise. I'm at the gate waiting for a flight.
Thanks, Meryl.
Yeah, thank you. Any need to explore MWBE suppliers?
Yes, for sure. That's a very active conversation at Scholastic. It's an active action to find minority and women-owned businesses. I just had a conversation yesterday about that. So we're coordinating ourselves. It is a part of our vendor searching and onboarding. It's a part of that conversation, and I think we'll continue to grow. It's very, very active, particularly in some of our businesses where there are certain requirements around that. We have to meet certain expectations, and it's our desire to do that.
In terms of, so you do quite a bit of printing, I believe, in China. Are you at all concerned about like the mounting rhetoric about tariffs and trade wars and things like that with China?
Sure. We constantly are discussing it. As I mentioned earlier, Trump has certainly made some comments that give us great pause for concern. We've modeled, what would happen if scenarios. They're concerning. One of the reasons why we have developed a much broader global platform is in part because of that potential. We have a great relationship with our vendors in China. We do produce a lot there. They do an excellent job for us. We're leaning into I mentioned Monopol in India as a big partner for us, Graphica, and again, looking to North America, Mexico, and the US. So in part, what's been driving our global view and our desire to be able to quickly move things is the concern, to a certain extent, the concern about what might happen with China tariffs going forward.
When you're making the placement decisions, are you using total cost of ownership, or is it primarily unit manufacturing costs because that dominates?
I would say it's both, and I'll comment, and then if Meryl is able, she can add to this as well as others can. We certainly look at a raw CPU, but when we're doing an analysis of printing in China versus Italy versus India versus Mexico versus US, we're looking at it from a landed cost perspective. So including all of our tariffs and duties, and of course freight, and what's it take to get it in from the East Coast versus the West Coast to our distribution center. So we're constantly looking at that full landed cost. Meryl, did you want to add anything to that, or you?
Well, no, not yet. The only thing I would add to that is that while we do look at the full cost of ownership, we try to break it out so that we keep the unit costs, the freight, and the tariffs separate in the systems, so that when we do go to move things quickly, we can see a breakdown easily.
Do you use like a homegrown system to manage that, or is that like off the shelf? I can't imagine it's off the shelf.
Right now, it's just in our master system, which is Epic. It wasn't custom built. We did actually have to go back and have some fields added years ago because many of our items have more than one component and sometimes more than one tariff. So we did customize that a little bit.
Thank you. Any signs, well, as long as we're talking about costs here, any signs of paper weakness? How do you manage that?
When you
Kevin?
say weakness, do you mean availability?
Availability, yeah, exactly.
Well, it just so happens I see Lisa Sarah here in front of me on the monitor. I would say, and Lisa will probably I'm sure have a different take. I would say right now it feels pretty stable. Certainly stable versus where we were 18 months ago. That said, and Lisa will be proud of me here, there's just not a lot of extra capacity. So I think the concern being if any paper machine is taken out, that grade is going to come under great stress, and then it's a little bit of a tipping point for the paper industry. Lisa, I saw you came off mute. Did I say anything that would get me in trouble?
Nope, I was going to say that's exactly what I was going to say. So
See, I listen.
straight on.
Very good. And EUDR, are you concerned about that?
Yeah. My take is there's a lot of confusion with what's happening with EUDR. We are working with a lot of people on this call to understand it as requirements are more clearly defined. Lisa, in addition to paper and compliance, a lot of other things, is also heading up our EUDR. We were happy to see that it was delayed by a year.
Potentially delayed.
Okay. Potentially delayed by a year. Thank you, Lisa. So yeah, I think it certainly has our attention. We're doing a lot of work to try and figure out what it means. But I do think there's a lot of confusion across the board, not just within print, but all industries affected.
So that was the end of the questions that I had, but I also have seen a number come in to the side here. So I'd be interested, please, anybody come off of mute and ask a question.
I think Matt Cannell has a couple. Maybe we start with those.
Hey, yeah, Kevin, I was, as you're talking about lead times offshore, I was wondering, are you planning on a certain number of weeks and that's kind of stable across as you're placing new titles that you use a certain number of weeks and it changes not very frequently, or are those lead times changing quite a bit based on like current turnarounds and that sort of thing, kind of trying to see if you're leaving plenty of time to make sure everything would be able to fall within that time frame, or whether you're cutting it closer to try to make that lead time, from order to arrival at the warehouse as short as possible.
It's a good question. And again, Merrill would have to correct me. But pre-pandemic, I would say my sense is that at Scholastic, those lead times were pretty stable. And as I recall, it was like 55 days for Asia, and really we were primarily with Asia and domestic. When COVID hit and then the supply chain crunch happened, like everyone, I mean, the lead times were flying all over the place. 55 went to 60 and 60 went to 68. And I think we were up to 90 plus days at one point. It was frequent changes. Things settled down, but I would say in the last 6 months, I don't know if Adam Mann is on from our supply team, but in the last 6 months, we're seeing similar, not as hectically affecting our lead times as it did during that supply chain time, but there is Adam.
I'm here. Yeah.
We are seeing, whether it's a container issue or a port strike. Adam, why don't you give your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, things have definitely gotten better from when we were in that crunch during COVID, but between the East Coast port strike and the concerns with the continued potential of the East Coast port strike, and obviously the issues in the Suez, we've definitely seen an increase in lead times, whether it's coming from India and just, miscellaneous delays that we'll see at different ports. but we've continued to make adjustments to our lead times, working with our logistics team. They provide that information, and we collectively get together and determine if we need to add or remove some of the lead time as we continue to monitor things. So I think we're in a good spot right now. We have a lot of extra time built in, and our logistics team continues to monitor and says, okay, we're seeing an average amount of time come through. We can make adjustments here or there. So it's something that we're definitely staying on top of.
Okay, so you're leaving enough buffer time that things, can come in on time, and then if the conditions start changing where you feel like it's more stable, you can tighten and pull that back down or go the other way. Okay.
Absolutely. And we honestly try to leave as much time to capture the majority of the shipments. It can't really be an average, because we can't have 50% of our items miss and 50% hit. We really need to have our ETAs, since they're visible across the company. Everybody's looking to know when that product's coming in. So we need to make sure that, like, I'd rather oversell basically and say, we're expected to be on this date. If it comes in a little bit earlier, great. But we can't have an expectation that someone's going to come in on a certain date and show up a week or two late. So it's really important that we, keep that buffer as strong as it is. But again, just monitor it, make sure we're not completely overestimating.
And I think we have a good positive tension. I mean this in the best circumstances, Adam. What I mean is, Merrill and the manufacturing team are always pushing for as fast as they can, and the supply team, Adam, and our logistics team are being conservative, as they should. So we kind of challenge each other to the extent that makes sense, but we always will let the supply team own that piece to keep us out of trouble, quite frankly.
Adam, what are you using, generally speaking, for lead times from, say, Spain, Italy?
As of right now, our lead times out of Europe, primarily Italy, which is where the vast majority of our European volume is coming from, is set to 65 days.
65?
Yeah, but that was specifically to account for the East Coast strike, meaning that if we were going to have to bypass the East Coast and go to the West Coast, it was going to add, a couple of extra weeks to it. We're leaving it at 65 right now until we get confirmation that they finally come to an agreement and we feel confident that everything is settled with the East Coast, where at that point we would probably bring it back down to 45, which is what we did have it prior to this conflict.
So when you're using Eastern Europe, do you use the same factor?
We don't have a ton of volume coming out of Eastern Europe. So for the most part, I would say it's really between 45 and 60. And that's really the exit factory date, just so you're aware. That's what we're using those dates from. So it's from the time that they're expected to, have those orders ready. So it includes, the booking time, like a little bit of extra time before the goods get turned over.
So you would have looked at moving Europe around all the way to the West Coast as opposed to down through Canada.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
We did. I believe our logistics team did look into Canada routes as well. And obviously there's a number of issues happening right now through Canada. There's a couple of strikes that are going on at some of those ports as well. So, they're the ones who are kind of balancing the cost with the lead time and figuring out what our best routes would be.
Understood.
How do you think about allocating volume when you're doing that split print run between domestic and overseas? How do you think about how much goes domestic and how much overseas?
Well, the easiest way is what's required. So in a case where we've got an initial printing, we're going to look at what's required for the initial sell, the initial laydown. And if we can add offshore and still make those dates work, we would. But more likely than not, that will determine the quantities we need in the U.S. To the extent that we can work multiple regions, U.S. and other, and manage our pricing to a point that works for the P&L. We'll put as much as we can in the States to minimize risk and ensure that we've got backup plans. That's ideal. One of our recent big titles, we printed the majority in the U.S. and we did it at a price that that worked well, but that's a unique situation.
I lived through the pandemic in 2020 also. Talking about a total nightmare. I haven't heard anybody mention paper. Is that a concern?
Currently,
Yes, because I'm always concerned about paper now. I don't think I'll ever lose that.
I think as Lisa said some time ago, right now we feel it's stable. Lisa's team is working daily to ensure we've got the right paper in the right place at the right time. During the pandemic, during that period, it was, as everyone knows, it was horrific, and everyone got every piece of paper that they could get their hands on. Now I think we're in more of a managed state.
Do you guys?
Kevin, can I ask you to go back to the pre-press questions or your pre-press workflow? Are you based mainly in an Adobe workflow, or are you using additional pre-press tools for pre-flighting and stuff like that?
Well, we're primarily Adobe based with our businesses, and then we have an outside firm that we do pre-press work with as well. But I would say it's primarily Adobe. I don't know. I don't think Irene's on, but Tho or Meryl, if you have any other thoughts on that.
It is primarily Adobe, Kevin.
Okay. And it's your pre-press department or your the people who are providing the files internally, are they doing a thorough check on those files prior to them going to the printer?
I think so. I mean, there are still issues that pop up. Ironically, the same issues we were battling, 20 years ago, fonts and RGB files, resolution, the same things. Yeah. After all these years, we're still trying to figure that out. But I think that the design team does a pretty nice job of trying to make those files as clean as possible. The current issue that everyone's kind of talking about are the Type 1 fonts and what do we do with that? So we've got a plan in place for that. But I think generally speaking, they're relatively good. We're always going to have issues, but it's not anything that I think is on our radar as a critical failure issue for us.
Okay. Thanks.
So are there minimum quantities that you'd consider for distributed printing globally?
Well, I would say it's a good question. If it's just an offset title, I'm not sure. We haven't identified a minimum quantity, but I think it makes sense to put as high of a quantity as possible to make it reasonable for the manufacturer. Where you start to get into some fun conversations is when you can mix digital and offset together, and of course, with digital, you don't have a minimum quantity. We're doing some of that. We did a lot more of it during the pandemic when we were scattering, with those 50 million units. But I would say I don't think we set a minimum order quantity for distributed. It's more of a conversation for those titles that require that big distribution. We've got 4, 5, 6, 7 subsidiaries across the globe. So a piece of it is, what do those subsidiaries need, and where can we print and provide inventory for those subsidiaries in a way that satisfies their pub dates, but still gets us a CPU that everyone likes. So it's a pretty active conversation.
Tony Kumas mentions filling a container. Does that come into print quantities, or is that like inbound consolidation, or how do you think about that?
Adam would be best to answer this, but I think what we've done is we've partnered with manufacturers where we produce enough volume that we're constantly filling containers, and it's less of a concern when you've got a high degree of volume at those facilities. And in fact, I think it's harder for us when we don't have a lot of concentrated volume at those facilities, because then we're trying to figure that out. Adam?
This is international volume? I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, our freight forwarders will consolidate our orders as well. So obviously, if we have enough, if enough at a certain supplier to fill a container, then that's obviously what we're going to be looking to do. If there's not, they will that volume could get consolidated at the port with a number of Scholastic orders to try and fill the container. So yes, we do we try as hard as we can to send full containers wherever possible, maximize our cost.
That's a great service for the freight forwarder. This may be a culture question, and it's Brian's. Have you found that you need to develop new skills or approaches to work with these suppliers that are based elsewhere in the world? Brian, feel free to elaborate on that.
Well, I was just thinking that, you've opened up markets that you haven't previously done business with before. Is language an issue? Are there lead times for getting answers that you have to deal with, or is it pretty much business as usual, but just in a different market?
I think each market has presented a different problem. My response to that would be it's been more in compliance than in production. Specifications have been a challenge. We're not all using the same measurements and the same grams and thicknesses, and so there's a piece of that. But what I found interesting, and I'm sure Mauro won't mind me sharing this, when we started working in Italy, we produced a title and they sent sample books over, and we opened the box and the sample books were just kind of flopping around in there. And as a result, there was damage. And so we spoke with Graphica, and we found out that at that time they didn't carton a lot of things in Italy. It's more of a shrink wrap environment. So learning things like that. And in this case, helping Graphica understand what our carton issues are required in the U.S. makes them a better partner for us, and then it gives them an opportunity to learn to work with other U.S. publishers. And similar issues in Mexico and India. So I think it's more about the nuances of the expectation of what our work is, and making sure that those partners understand it, and we do a good job of communicating it up front. Meryl and Lisa and Adam spend a fair amount of time in ensuring our compliance and our specifications are up to date globally and sharing those out.
Monica mentioned something that I've never even heard of. Like, she's asking, how popular are sprayed edges for you? Are they increasingly in demand? And first off, what are sprayed edges?
Yes. Is that Monica Delgado?
Yes.
Hey, Monica, it's good to see your name on the monitor. It's been a long time. Yes, is the quick answer. So ton of what we're seeing is stained edges or printed edges. Okay. And again, Meryl could talk about this far more eloquently than I. But basically, stained edge, it's a relatively, I'll say, rediscovered application. There are inkjet machines where you essentially put book blocks into an inkjet machine, and the inkjet machine will either spray a solid stain across the face and the top and bottom, or now it's capable to print an image. So it's you can do stencils, or you can do a very high quality picture of a character in the book, as an example. This popped up, I'd say, in the last year in terms of really a lot of attention, and we're seeing use across the industry, and as a result, right now it's really hard to find manufacturers who have capacity to take that work on.
Fascinating. So it's like a new popular thing that people are doing with books.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of people are saying, listen, if you want, we'll buy a machine if you commit to it. But is this a fad? Is it going to go away in 2 years, or is it here to stay? I don't know. I think there's room to debate. But right now, it's really hot.
And Ali's asking, or I don't know if it's Ali or Ali, but do you do sprayed edges in China, the US, or both?
Both, all Italy,
Everywhere.
yes.
All right.
Wherever sprayed edges are known.
I was
Yeah.
trying to put a picture in the chat, but the admin restrictions
Oh, thanks,
said
Debbie.
no go.
Yeah, we're very tough that way.
Yeah,
The
US as well. I've had conversations this week with one of our US partners, CJK, about their capacity, and everyone's full. Everyone's full. So it's really hot right
Ken, there was one question that David Hetherington asked, and I reposted it about sustainability. Do you? I know it's an important topic for Scholastic, but do you have the same expectations for sustainability for your domestic and international providers?
A super important area for us. Again, we got a lot of people working on it at Scholastic, a few of the folks on the call right now. We're working really hard to make sure we're happy with where we are from a sustainability standpoint. I think we've made a ton of progress. And we're beginning to talk to vendors about their sustainability plan. So it's a part of our onboarding process now, to understand, much like our customers are doing with us, to understand what the strategy is for the vendors we're working with. And I think I'll say this because I think it's true. We're finding that our partners in Asia and Europe are far ahead of our partners in the US in terms of real action on sustainability. So some of the conversations we have are really easy, and some of our partners are super advanced. And I've brought up Graphica a number of times, Leo, Monopol, all working hard and quite advanced, and in some cases net zero. With some of our other partners, it's more of a challenging conversation, and I think we're trying not to make it a difficult conversation. I think we're sharing where we are and where we're going, and we want all of our partners to know that, and then help to the extent that we can push their developing of their own sustainability strategies. But it is a formal part of our onboarding now, whereas it had not been in years past.
At Frankfurt, the Green Book Alliance hosted a 3-hour workshop on the sustainability data collection and reporting. A couple of people who were there are on the call today, and we're going to be coming back to the industry, particularly in BISG's case, the US industry, to make some recommendations on better practices. Hopefully that'll be helpful for you.
Yeah, that's a great conversation.
Hey, we're about done with time here. There was one question about sprayed edges again. Is that the same as thumb edge and foot edge inkjet, or are those different topics?
I don't know that I'm not sure I've heard thumb edge and foot edge.
Yeah, I know I haven't. Ted, do you want to explain it?
Maybe look
Yeah,
to unmute.
Yeah, it might be on mute. Okay.
Brooke Horn also wants to know about deckled edges, but Brooke always wants to know about deckled edges. So
I love deckled edges, and it's really hard to find old school deckled edges. You can find the deckled edge now that it's done on the folders or the cutters, where it's basically peaks and valleys, even consistent peaks and valleys. Old school deckled edge, it's very difficult to find where it's torn paint, looks like torn paint. But I think it looks great. Not a lot of people use that.
yeah, we took a trip last December to Versa Press in East Peoria, Illinois, and Brooke was grilling Matt Cannell on why he couldn't support deckled edges.
Just don't trim them. Just don't trim them. Let people do with them with their knife. So Kevin, thank you so much for being on the call and answering all these questions and having your team with you as well. This has been really a great interactive session, and I think we've all learned a huge amount. So again, thank you.
Well, it's always fun, and it is a great team. And as you can see on this call, I rely on them for most of what I do, and thank them for that. And again, as I said, it's a really good distraction from what's happening around us right now, which we can't get away from. But we're almost done. Thank God, we're almost through it. But thank you. It was a pleasure. Happy to be here.
Good seeing everyone. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Very
Kevin.
much
Thanks, Kevin.
appreciate it.